Good evening. Welcome to Tantur. I really appreciate you coming out this evening for the very first program that we are running in 2 years, our Tuesdays at Tantur. In the past, these lectures have been twice a month. They are now going at once a month. The brochures for our next month's lecture are out in the lobby, so before you go home, you'll be reminded to be sure to take one of those. So again, thank you for your attendance here this evening. My name is Father John Paul. I'm the rector here at Tantur Ecumenical Institute, and I'm here with our staff of the Ecumenical Institute. Father Jonas Masson, Program Director, Nizar Haloun, Program Director, and Sister Marie Feruza Maximos, Program Coordinator. So we're very, very happy to have you here this evening. Tonight's lecture deals with archaeology in this particular time period. It is my pleasure to present Father Joseph Briffa, who is the director of the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome. He's a biblical archaeologist. And so I present to you Father Joseph, and he will tell you a little bit more about himself.
Good evening. And
also, in case anybody needs to use a restroom, it's just right out in the lobby. There's coffee and tea here. Please help yourself. Sorry.
No worries. Thanks. Thanks, John Paul. Good evening, and many thanks for that very kind introduction and for the invitation to come here at Tantur. Just to say a bit more about myself, in a sense now, as Father John Paul mentioned, I'm director, well, not in Rome, far from it yet, but here in Jerusalem. But my background is in archaeology and in scripture, and so, you know, I'm one of those archaeologists who's quite convinced that you can't talk about archaeology unless you get your hands dirty and are involved in the work. So I am actively involved in an excavation at Azekah with Tel Aviv University primarily and Heidelberg University. Well, when Father John Paul extended the invitation, I must admit I jumped upon it quite readily, perhaps naively. Well, Bible and archaeology are a vast and complex topic, and I notice quite a distinguished audience as well. And trying to say something about the state of archaeology and Bible today, about recent discoveries in the field, is actually quite a vast topic to deal with. There's plenty of specialist reviews that deal with that. There are conferences dedicated, 3-day conference dedicated only to the archaeology of Jerusalem, let alone whether in a few minutes I can actually be talking about, archaeology and the Bible in 2021. But then I'm not good at turning down such invitations, so in a sense much to my fault, I must say. But it provides me with an interesting challenge. After all, I teach archaeology and Bible. As I said, I'm actively involved in excavation. So it's good to take a step back and try to say something about the state of biblical archaeology, for the want of a better term. If I had to find a guiding question or a couple of guiding questions, it would probably be something like, what do we know now that we didn't know then, say, about 10 years ago in the field of archaeology and Bible? And more importantly, how does this help us understand better the context and the text that we're dealing with? By the way, one practical note, I'm not planning this to be, much as I have notes in front of me, I'm not planning this to be just some speech. So please, do put your hand up, do intervene, do ask questions. It will make it far more interesting for you and for myself. Well, I mentioned 10 years, as a 10-year kind of gap. 10 years might sound like a long time, and certainly it is from a news point of view. And yes, even in a discipline like archaeology, developments in the field can sometimes move quite fast. On the other hand, and dare I say, especially in a world like archaeology and Bible, findings take years to consolidate, and even far longer to trickle down to the general public, to become the quote-unquote received wisdom that helps a better understanding of the Bible. I think as an archaeologist who is involved in the field, one of the frustrations sometimes is, people still pick up actually very good commentaries on the Bible, or very good works, sometimes even published quite recently, and you realize that the archaeology that they're dealing with is actually quite dated. Why? And again, I'm not faulting whoever is writing the commentaries. I fault sometimes, our own field, that, it takes time for things to trickle down, for our understanding, our developing understanding of the world of the Bible to actually enter into the, day-to-day understanding of the text itself. Well, I decided to have a title that is a bit provocative. I said, Beyond the Hype. Well, let's face it, we live in a world of social media, we live in a world of clickbait, we're flooded with tons of material, there's reams and reams of stuff to read, and somehow we need to reel people in. And archaeology and Bible in this field are no exception. You can pick up some of the headlines, some of them in the local Israeli press, some in, international media, some in popular science and archaeology, magazines like Biblical Archaeological Review, for example, which, mind you, in fairness to Bob Gargle, has been the editor for the last few years. I think it's taken a much more serious academic turn, but that's another story as well. But it's clear, that you can see that the titles are aimed to be striking, to draw your attention, to basically ask you to read the article and move on. And of course, we archaeologists love the limelight, who doesn't? And anything relating to the Bible, after all, sells. This is one thing that I think is very clear, especially here in anything that deals with the Holy Land. Anything that deals with the Bible, with the Hebrew Scriptures, with the New Testament, still clearly sells. You bring in some biblical figure, perhaps David, perhaps Isaiah, maybe Jesus or the Apostles, and bingo, you're guaranteed to hit the headlines, even at the BBC. And to bring the talk a bit more locally, Israeli press regularly features articles on the quote-unquote latest archaeological discoveries with titles and photos aimed at the general public. Mind you, I say latest, quote-unquote, because often enough by the time they're in the media here, archaeologists in the field have known about them for about 2-3 years, because of course we've been discussing this stuff in the background. And here are some of the examples actually from the last 6 months in Haaretz and Jerusalem Post. And as I said, needless to say, the Bible sells well, even nowadays. And if you manage to fan a bit the flames of controversy, even better. You will sell even more. One good question to me is, why the hype? And the reasons are varied and complex. Well, let me start with what could be the elephant in the room. Of course, in Jerusalem and in this land in general, matters of national narrative, of ownership of heritage, of legitimation, are never far below the surface. I think we'd have to be particularly naive not to be aware of that, at least. But it's far more complex than that. And by the way, this is true of history and archaeology everywhere, not just here in Israel and Palestine. Heritage, history, archaeology are always part of a wider narrative of how we define ourselves, not only from a national point of view, but actually each and every one of us, how we place ourselves also within this narrative. And whether we are aware of it or not, whether we state it or not explicitly, we are placing ourselves within that context. And in my case, I find, let me not go too far, but actually turn to my own personal situation. As a biblical scholar and as an archaeologist, my research interests in the archaeology here tend to focus on the late Iron Age. Well, that's mostly the latter years, the final years of the kingdom of Judah from a biblical point of view. And because of my teaching, I have to focus mostly on the Iron Age, but also, on these later stuff, like the Romans, Jesus, That's when Jesus and the first church appears. It's actually outside my usual field of research, but still, because of teaching, I have to cover it. But this betrays in many ways my own loyalties. This heritage here particularly interests me because it shapes the Judeo-Christian heritage to which I belong. I'm interested in this primarily because of the Bible. Much as an archaeologist, and in my case, even being responsible for a wonderful collection of Chalcolithic material, there isn't the same kind of relationship with the material. Because in a way, it doesn't define me in the same way, and I think this we need to be conscious of. Secondly, there are some issues that are even closer to the surface than this. Excavation and research is expensive. And so is running university departments. Not everyone appreciates the contribution of the humanities and of history, and on the face of it, of course, it appears less productive, less useful, has less of an immediate economic purpose than departments of the sciences and so on. And over the past year, we've heard of far too many departments of archaeology and ancient history and ancient languages, where chairs are being closed down, where entire departments are being closed down. So no wonder that archaeologists and projects vie for the spotlight. As an archaeologist, you need to keep your university and your sponsors interested in the work that you do, to keep the project going and the money flowing in, because otherwise you don't have the money for the next lab research and so on. And also to keep the university, from cutting down on the faculty, from, when they're downsizing because money is not flowing into the department because they don't have enough students, not to decide to cut this chair and the other one. Perhaps even axing the entire department. There's been a couple of glamorous cases in the UK on that. Well, there's also a question of public interest, especially when dealing with competing economic forces. And let's face it, archaeology can be quite inconvenient and often the bane of developers. Well, if you've driven past, the main road from, passing alongside Bet Shemesh heading to Beit Jimal and then further on, you possibly know what I'm talking about. This is a perfect example. Why should society be interested in what we find and do, in having to make space for archaeology and development plans, in making public infrastructure even more expensive, because all the trenches that you see dug there, of course, are being paid by the development project. They're being dug by the Antiquities Authority in this case, or actually on behalf of the Antiquities Authority. So basically, to add insult to injury, not only are you asking, in this case, the national infrastructure to make space and time in the developing of a major road, a major artery, but to add insult to injury, you're asking them also to pay the bills. And saying, why on earth should they be doing that? And that's a good question. That is why also sometimes things get hyped up a bit. Well, on a more positive note, there's also a question of public archaeology. I choose deliberately one from Azekah, which is the site where I'm part of the team, so that I can criticize that too. When we present the work to the public, we tend to spice it up. You cannot get the public interested, or even the average volunteer for that matter, if we speak simply of the hours of toil through the layers of dust, sometimes quite meaningless dust, than to find some, IDF garbage pit at the bottom. I did this year. And collecting of shirts that end up on the dump pile once they have been read, or not deemed significant. Hours trying to understand the stratigraphy. It's much easier, and this particular article was a case in point, it's much easier to sell the idea of nice finds, or at least a nice story. Mind you, it sometimes was an issue even dealing with the volunteers, by the way, and with the students, because when you're selling this idea of the finds saying, I'm not terribly interested in the individual find, because that is not what gives me the bigger picture. So, we can, again, discuss that if you will have any questions on that at the end, or even now, by the way, as I said. Now, that's not how archaeology works, of course. This is a two-edged sword. Since we risk ourselves perpetuating the myth of archaeology as a glamorous form of treasure hunting, of some bygone era adventure, when you're asking people to be paying money for the luxury of coming to work in the heat of an Israeli summer, of course you need to glamorize it a bit. And it's a hard sell, to convince people to the back-breaking boredom. That is a good chunk of our work. The heat, the dust, the late hours, trying to keep the documentation in order, especially if you're on staff, which is only mitigated actually by working in a good team, so it's fun to be with that crowd, but it's hard work. And maybe with the promise of clear results, maybe at the end of the season, in my experience, usually at the end of the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth season, when you have been working at it for quite a while. Okay, in a sense. By now, I hope to have you a bit on the hook, and maybe time now to reel you in. No, stop. Now I guess I should flesh out concretely a bit what I propose. And of course it would be impossible. I'm not even trying to synthesize all the archaeology that has been happening in Israel, in Jerusalem, in the Palestinian territories over the last few years. So I chose some of the developments and the news stories in the last years, mostly where I could, quite recent ones. And for good measure, I'll take some that are bad. I'll take 3 of them. 10 that are good, and 1 that is downright quirky. I'll leave that to the end. And as I already said at the beginning, there are two questions that for me are fundamental. Two questions that I put there in front of the students as well, when I'm teaching courses. What do we know now that we didn't know before this particular find? And more importantly, how does it actually help us understand better the text and the context? Because in a sense, otherwise, the find in itself can be quite meaningless. It can be simply, souvenir hunting, something that will be nice in a museum. Did we learn more about the text, about the context? Precious little. Well, I want to start a bit with my pet peeves. I think that's the easiest one. And I will pick up only 3. And more than anything, they are, rather than just individual stories, they are representative of some aspects that I deem quite problematic actually from a method point of view. Firstly, which is the case that I bring here, is an obsession with names, and especially, purported biblical personages. I present only a selection, but in many ways it's a genre of biblical news items, and even in journals and so on. One particularly notorious example back in 2018 is this one here, where a purported seal of the prophet Isaiah from the excavations of the so-called city of David were presented to the world by the late Dr. Eilat Mazar. Almost not to be outdone, I think I have a picture of that. Within the same months, the archaeologists of the Antiquities Authority made sure to publicize the finding of their own seal regarding the governor of the city. Again, a title that we would expect to have in a city like Jerusalem. And this last year, we've had Professor Yossi Garfinkel of Hebrew University publicizing his finding of the name of Yeruba'al on a shirt from Kirbet el-Rai, close to Lachish. Okay, and in this case, talking about the 3 of them, actually, I need to be a bit clear. I'm not questioning actually the archaeological work itself. Much as I disagree with the interpretations of the late Dr. Mazar and even with Professor Garfinkel, I think their archaeological work and the archaeological documentation actually has brought to light some very interesting results. We cannot deal anymore with archaeology and the Bible without really referring to the work that Dr. Mazar did, especially in the area of the city of David, and Professor Garfinkel in places like Kirbet Kayafa in particular, and now at Kirbet el-Rai. I'd like to look in particular in this case at the case of the so-called Isaiah Bulla. And for the sake of argument, I'd like to set aside for the moment that discussion about the reading of the Bulla itself, which may or may not read as the name of Isaiah. I will not delve into that now. For the time being, for the sake of argument, let us take that as read. Let us presume that actually we can read it correctly as a bulla of Isaiah the prophet. My question is this: what do we learn from a bulla like this? Does the bulla add any information whatever, anything new to our understanding of the text and the context? Well, actually, in my opinion, not. I'd like to call this, perhaps at some point it will catch on, in archaeological parlance. I'd like to call this the Richelieu premise. Who knows? Perhaps it will work. Let me explain. Okay. The presentation of the Isaiah Bulla actually comes with an imported, unstated idea. And basically the idea is this: if I can prove that a biblical figure existed, then somehow it is corroborating what the biblical text says about them. Right? Well, no. Because I dare say, as a historian, that I had no reason whatsoever to doubt the existence of a figure like Isaiah, nor doubt that he was a court prophet at the time of Hezekiah. I think, and probably most historians relating to the Bible would agree that for the latter part of the books of Kings, the text is generally corroborated with extra-biblical texts that we know. The general drift of the story, the general drift of what was happening, politically and internationally and even locally fits. And I think it's important for us to realize that even the most tendentious of histories do not invent their historical figures. They do not pick them out of thin air. But rather, to take a phrase from White, one prominent historian, they are invented as found, in a sense of the Latin invenire, that you find, a personage that is there already in the baggage of history, and somehow then you draw them into your narrative. So the good question is, does the Isaiah bulla, again, presuming that it is correctly understood, does it prove in any way what the Bible says about him? Well, I'm sure we can find plenty of portraits of Cardinal Richelieu. There are many proofs of his existence. Yet, I'm quite sure that no one would question that Alexandre Dumas' Three Musketeers is a book of fiction. In this sense, the finding of the bulla of the Isaiah, even if we were to agree that it could well be the bulla of a real person, called Isaiah, who was a prophet, a court prophet in Jerusalem. I say that specifically because it means he was a prophet working in, at the service of the king. It actually adds little to our understanding of the person or even of the biblical text. In many ways, it provides a lovely souvenir to add to the Israel Museum. Undoubtedly, it will be important for the visitors to see. I'd be more than delighted to take my own students. It will be on the list of the must-sees, that you tick the box at the museum. But actually, the real impact of our understanding of the text is slim. Our understanding of history, the real impact, is actually very slim. A second issue, of course, if it's not David, it's Jesus. And, the second issue, I think I'd take it even a step further. And this is the case, I think, with the Holy Land. We have to live with it. If it's not David or Solomon or Isaiah, it has to be Jesus or the apostles. Again, religion sells well. And nobody is going to be terribly interested in a restudy of a minor site, such as this case. But of course, Jesus, and all of a sudden you're on BBC. In this case, it's what I'm taking issue with, and again, it's more as an example, is the research of the remains below the convent of the Sisters of Nazareth, by Professor Ken Dark. Actually, it's a site that has been well known. It was a site that had already been studied years ago by a Jesuit of the Pontifical Biblical Institute, had been the surveyor of the Tel Eilat Rasul excavations. At some point, I need to do a bit more research because my understanding is that the internal censorship of the society, the internal peer review of the Pontifical Biblical Institute, had actually not approved his work for publication because they didn't find it, scientifically worthy enough. And I think for the same issues that I have issue with Professor Dark here. He has done, in fairness to him, he's a professor at Reading University, has done some very interesting survey work in the valley between Nazareth and Sepphoris, which suggests that the material culture on the two sides of the valley indicates different cultural spheres. So, I don't want to diss Professor Dark completely in his work. But here, his work at the Sisters of Nazareth convent is actually quite disappointing, and for the reason I mentioned. The site is problematic. We knew that. It's problematic because of the way it had been dug, way before even Father Senes, the Jesuit father that I mentioned. It had been dug, when the site was being developed by the nuns in the late 1800s. And, it wasn't well dug, it wasn't well documented. There's issues with the material, with context of the material, and that has long been known. And in fairness to Professor Dark, in trying to publish this, he did the best of a bad job. The problem, of course, is that the claims then in the media leave much to be desired, because, okay, and those are, by the way, the strong case idea are his words, but there is no particular evidence leading this particular site to Jesus than any other first century house in Nazareth. Or, we can link this house to any other person that we might possibly imagine living in Nazareth at the time. So again, but of course, if he said that, saying, I have a first century house in Nazareth, nobody would be bothered with his publication, and probably nobody would buy it. So in a sense, again, it's a question of saying, how do we read critically the kind of work that we are receiving? Well, a final pet peeve. and I don't even know where to start, is this one. Quite fresh off the press, a publication this year in no less a site than that of the journal Nature, not in the journal itself, but in Scientific Reports, regarding the site of Tel al-Hammam in Jordan, here picked up in the news section by the Smithsonian Institution. To be honest, I must say I'm disappointed with a journal like Nature. It's true that it's not in the journal per se, but they should have better oversight. When a major journal or a major news site picks up a story, it is read, whether we like it or not, as a form of endorsement. But dig deeper, and this story is much more one of fantasy, of biblical fundamentalist reading, of cherry-picking of evidence, all couched in scientific terminology, because, the example on the top right, at one point your eyes glaze over, even as an archaeologist, and it looks all terribly interesting, until, you realize that basically once the fog clears out, it's a bit more complicated and a bit more problematic. Had the peer review been done diligently, then a number of alarm bells should have rung and there should have been better scrutiny. Of course, being a biblical fundamentalist doesn't by default make your work completely wrong or unscientific, but any use of research should at least take into clear account the deep bias embedded in the research itself. And of course, and so, I don't want to stop on the criticism, on the deconstruction, but again, what do we know now that we didn't know then? What can we narrate, and choosing from stuff that happened in the last few years? I think, if I had to choose the first site, I'd go to Megiddo, which is a traditional battleground among archaeologists on issues of chronology of the late Iron Age, and linked with it the whole question of the United Monarchy. And I think it's fair to say that even if we look back 10 years ago, the battle lines regarding the United Monarchy had already been formed, and quite solidly so. It's very hard to summarize in a few sentences the issue, but basically it's twofold. Firstly, the absolute dating of the Iron Age 2A, which traditionally is linked with the monarchy of David and Solomon, and secondly, beyond the date itself, the association of this phase in northern sites like Megiddo with the Omerite dynasty, Omer Yahab, rather than Solomon. And the camps were very clear. On one side, Finkelstein with his arguments about row chronology with dates and excavation from Megiddo itself, and Amihai Mazar on the other with his modified conventional chronology, holding at least to some form of a united monarchy in the Iron Age 2A. One element that of the discussion has been the lowering of the date of gate 2156. There's many superimposed gates here. To stratum 4A, contemporary therefore with the stables, those of you familiar with the site of Megiddo, rather than with the palaces, which is the 5A, 4B, if I'm not mistaken. Recent archaeological work, though, in the last few years, has led the excavators to rethink that conclusion. And I quote, "The best fit for gate 2156 is stratum 5A, 4B, similar to Yigal-Yadin's observation, but for different reasons with different dating and historical interpretation. In fairness, the criticism of Yigal-Yadin's date and association with Solomon, which was based on one verse, 1 Kings 9:15, remains. But I think this is the kind of example that shows that archaeology, like all science, is always works in progress." I move on closer to us. Another major argument against the United Monarchy had been the paucity of the remains in Jerusalem. Back in the 1960s, major scholars like Dame Kathleen Kenyon, based on the few remains from the late Iron Age outside the southeastern hill of Silwan, the so-called City of David, argued for a very small Jerusalem in the earlier part of the Iron Age. Even though then the finding of the broad wall in the Jewish quarter obliged archaeologists to accept that the city expanded at least in the 8th century, that is, around the time of the biblical king Hezekiah and the time of the threat from Assyria. However, the received wisdom for many decades, therefore, was of a small Jerusalem in the 10th and 9th century, with the city expanding only in the 8th century after the destruction of the northern kingdom. And this fit well with the ideas of low chronology and the absence of a united monarchy. Well, this received wisdom was not particularly challenged with the excavations around the Gihon Spring first, which is basically this kind of huge structures that were found, because initially they were dated to the Middle Bronze Age, by Roni Reich and Eli Shukron on the basis of the pottery. Well, it was received wisdom until a few years ago, 2017, a team of archaeologists and radiocarbon dating specialists published a paper that proposed a radical redating of this fortification, pushing the date to the 9th century. In one fell swoop, Jerusalem had an impressive fortification and public infrastructure contemporaneous with the infrastructure in the Northern Kingdom. And I know, even though I haven't managed to find it at least in print, but Professor Yuval Gadot, who has been digging in the Givati parking lot area in Silwan, is also starting to posit at least 9th century dates for some of the works in that area. And as I said, in fairness to him, I still need to see it in print, but it would be quite interesting to see how this will develop our ideas of Jerusalem at the time of the monarchy. One other site that is extremely interesting and not far from Jerusalem is the Temple of Moza. Many of you might not be aware, but when you pass over the site every time that you take Highway 1 out of Jerusalem, and it was a happy discovery some 10 years ago, precisely during the rebuilding of that highway, initially as a salvage excavation by the IAA, and in the last 3 years as a research excavation by Tel Aviv University with the IAA, actually directed by the same archaeologist who published the first dig. And why is Tel Moza so fascinating? I mean, the clear cultic sites in ancient Judah are actually very few. So finding a temple site so close to Jerusalem, and therefore, of course, where we would have expected to have a temple in Jerusalem, is quite fascinating. It's interesting also to see what comes up at the site and how this will shed light on religious and cultic practices in the ancient kingdom of Judah. Of course, I think we need to be careful about the kind of hype that comes out around these things, this time not from the excavation team itself, but on basis of comparative material from Kirbet Kayafa. This is an article by Garfinkel. And believe me, figurines are notoriously impossible to really define and explain. So beyond the headlines, I think some claims are purely wishful thinking. It's hard for us to read these sites as well without falling into the traps of trying to define things in terms of Yahvistic, non-Yahvistic, pagan, not pagan, legitimate, not legitimate. And in these cases, I think it's easy to read the material to read into the material without realizing that we're not letting the material inform us, but rather we're reading into it and imposing on it our own opinions and our own ideas. Moving to another temple site, at the heart of from the heart of the ancient kingdom of Judah to its periphery, I'll go to a project that takes us to the border fortress of Tel Arad, which protects the southern flank of the hill country. But the site, unfortunately, despite having been published decades ago now, still awaits definitive publication. But new studies have been done in the meantime, including this one, which focuses on some of the ostraka, some of the sherds with writing that have been subjected to forensic analysis, both through computer algorithms and even by professional forensic document examiners. And the argument is that of these 18 documents, there's a high probability of having at least 12 writers represented in the corpus. This, the scholars argue, indicates a high level of literacy represented there. We would have expected there to be 1, 2, 3 scribes in a fortress, but that actually these represent a bigger number might suggest that literacy was much more present. And of course the implications of this, which is not directly mentioned in the study, regards actually then biblical writing. When do we start having more significant texts in the kingdom of Judah? Moving on, again to quite a variety of bits and pieces of information. Archaeological work in Jerusalem continues to bring surprises, and one of them was this fully articulated piglet that was found in the destruction debris of a house dated from the 8th century BC, so from the latter part of the Judahite monarchy. I mean, just in general, of course, faunal remains help us archaeologists understand dietary practices. And here, of course, it is particularly interesting that from the way it was found, it was alive when it was crushed. So it's not just a question of piglet bones being found in Jerusalem, but actually clearly a live animal that had been reared in the city of Jerusalem. And of course it is particularly fascinating because the received wisdom among archaeologists and scholars would have been that pigs would already have been a taboo animal by this time in Judah. And again, so So much for sometimes what are preconceived ideas. No, then the archaeology then throws up something, throws a spanner in the works. And it's good to ask ourselves, what questions do these things raise? How do we have to rethink sometimes what we think we know about science? I also want to bring you to, well, actually that's the part of the area I supervise. So I had to, of course, to bring this at some stage Azekah in. And it is a fascinating site, and over 9 seasons of excavation, the site that has started to reveal some of its secrets. In various areas of excavation, we have uncovered, they're not shown here, some significant stretches of Middle Bronze Age fortifications. Again, on the one hand, not a great surprise, because, in the land of Canaan, in the land of Israel, Palestine today, we do have many major fortification sites, many major fortified cities from the Middle Bronze Age. We didn't know anything really about Tel Azekah in that period. So that was quite interesting. And we do have a significant destruction and abandonment of the site in the late Bronze Age. I actually suspect that these human remains that were found here, despite what Haaretz decided to label them as, if I'm not mistaken, the late Bronze Age, not Iron Age. Because one of the things that is quite fascinating is that the site seems to have been abandoned to the state that nobody actually returned to recover the dead. Something that most people don't usually understand is, usually even when there has been a severe destruction on a site, you rarely find human remains. Why? Because generally speaking, even after a major disaster, if there's anyone left of that community, the one thing that they do is usually try to recover their dead and give them a proper burial. If there is something that leads to a total devastation, and for the late for the late Bronze Age in Tel Azekah, it seems to be the case. It seems to be that wherever you dig and reach that level, if you reach the destruction level, you're likely to find someone as well still there. We also have been recovering destruction levels from the late Iron Age, which are more immediately of interest to me at least, where we do expect in Azekah destruction levels brought from the invasions of Sennacherib, so from the Assyrians around 701 BC, and also from the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, in 587-586 BC, because we know that this site, we know it even from scripture, is basically a parallel site to the site of Lachish, Tel Edoué, because it is another major fortification of the kingdom of Judah in the lower hills of the Shephelah. We also have part of at least this part here, badly preserved, but still there, part of a late Iron Age gateway with a fascinating stretch of the drainage ditch below it, and part of the plaza, not there anymore because we dug it up, and a site that is yielding its secrets step by step. But again, quite interesting, because Azekah was known to be one of those major sites for the late Iron Age. Again, as often, we are slowly expanding. We had the destruction level, basically this year comes exactly from here, that little corner that we dug this year. We had destruction level in this whole room there last year, and some stuff here as well. Sorry, 2 years ago, we didn't dig there last year. And again, all this helps slowly our understanding of how, the kingdom of Judah came to its bitter end, in the time of the Babylonian invasion. Moving ahead, but not too much, this next set of finds that I'll be discussing, I find highly problematic. At the same time, I cannot not talk about them. Unfortunately, they do not come from scientific archaeological excavations, but from the antiquities market. And the main problem from an ethical point of view is that it is quite likely that they may be the result of looting and of illegal trade in antiquities. But then, as well as I do, that Iraq, is where the origin of this place, and quite a chunk of the Middle East, has been through a series of devastating wars in the last decades. And lack of political stability often comes at a price, even for cultural heritage. It tends to slip down the lists of government and regime priorities, because either they don't have the resources, sometimes because they don't even have the will to protect their own cultural heritage. if not to say that sometimes they deliberately actually use it to their advantage, but not from a preservation point of view. And many of these tablets have been known, of this corpus, have been known for quite some time. You know, the first were published in 1999 and piecemeal over the first few years. But actually, the systematic publications of them is very recent. You know, actually in the last few years. We have now moved on, as I said, to the time of the Babylonian exile and of the post-exilic period. And these tablets are extremely interesting, which is why, despite the ethical questions that they raise, we cannot completely ignore them, because they give us a glimpse of the social and economic life of the Judahites who are now living in the land of Babylon, and in several cases clearly settled in there. You know, first of all, this provides us with an interesting glimpse into the world of the exiles, but also a sense of how people who migrate, whether the choice was theirs or not in the first place, eventually settle into the new land. These documents do not speak of a longing of the homeland or of an eagerness to return. In many cases, people clearly stayed behind and built new lives there. And so this provides an interesting counter-narrative, or at least a complementary narrative, to the one that we know from the Bible. I move on, also moving on quite quickly from a period's point of view, to come to the time of Jesus and Pontius Pilate. Again, you know, continuing archaeological work in Jerusalem has helped us to slowly understand better the development of the city in New Testament times. You know, when initially excavated, this stepped street was dated in the underground tunnels, okay, of the City of David Park. There's ethical issues from another point of view and ethical political issues, okay, because of course it digs under the main street in Silwan. But this was associated at the time much more with Herod the Great. You know, more recent, the research has shifted that date to the time of Pontius Pilate, which makes quite an interesting reading, because it means that there was a continued interest in the development of the city, even when the province now wasn't run anymore by a local king, but by a Roman governor. Of course, if you want to read it from the more pious point of view, this street is one of those that Jesus is likely to have frequented, because it leads from the Silwan pool that was excavated in 2005 right to the foot of Temple Mount. And beyond the piety itself, I think it's useful for us to understand the city of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, not so much for the architecture itself, but I think because all this helps us to understand the cultural influences that were present in the city. And I think this is true nowadays of scholars both of early Christianity and of Judaism. You know, we are both well aware of the risk of projecting back onto the earlier part of the first century the realities that came in the late first century after the capture of Jerusalem, after the destruction of the temple. And I think we are all aware that the more we understand Jerusalem, but for that matter even the Galilee, the more we understand, you know, our own history, you know, both, as I said, on both an understanding of Jesus, early Christianity, but even for that matter, you know, the complexity of first century Jewish life. One other project, and I think, you know, the Ecole should be happily interested as well. You know, one other project that I find quite fascinating is one on the topography of Jerusalem, and with a particular emphasis on the Ecce Arch. And this again is a reminder that archaeology isn't always about excavation, but also about what has been, you know, sometimes staring us in the face for quite a long while, what is hidden in plain sight. You know, very recently, it's already published in French, and I know from Dominique Marie that it's soon to be out in English. You know, it's his doctoral work, Father Dominique Marie Cabaret of the École Biblique, is a case in point. You know, Cabaret argues for what he calls, at least the way it's translated in English, as persistence of plan. You know, the possibility of reconstructing the fossil grid of various parts of Jerusalem, showing, in my opinion, quite convincingly, that actually below the present reality of the old city of Jerusalem, a lot of the grid and the planning of ancient Jerusalem survives right back to Hasmonean times, right back to Herodian times. And this, of course, can help us to reconstruct ancient Jerusalem, not only through the very small window of excavation. You know, in a way, excavating in Jerusalem is a bit like keyhole surgery. You know, they give you, you're lucky if they give you a few meters square. In this case, we're looking at a bigger picture, you know, the macro structure of the city. In my opinion, you know, the pièce de résistance is the reconsideration of the Ecce march, which scholars, you can pick up almost any guidebook, and they tend to date it to the Hadrianic city, associated with the Hadrianic paving of the so-called Lithostrotos. I think Cabaret's detailed analysis, and I'll leave you to go to the work itself, dates these arches, interpreting them as the new gate built by Herod the Great, for the new road coming in from the east. As the road network coming basically from the Mount of Olives area shifted, as the Temple Mount expanded north. Before there was a valley that probably had the original street itself. I thought I'd close at least this list of 10 finds at the Holy Sepulchre, even though one could argue that strictly it's a bit outside my remit. I'm outside talking about the archaeology and the Bible per se, since of course, but here, we can only at best go to the Constantinian time, not so much, the prehistory of the site at the time of Jesus and Hadrian. We know that the site itself at its base is primarily Constantinian, with very significant changes that happened during the Middle Ages, right down to the Crusaders. There are some changes that happened later too, but really, to understand the site, you need to understand the Constantinian period and the Crusaders. But recent work, and I'm sure you've heard of it, was undertaken at the Edicule of the Holy Tomb, and to the surprise of many restorers, and even to the archaeologists, the research and preparation of the site actually showed that quite a significant chunk of the rock, those of you who have been to the tomb in the last couple of years know that now there is a little window at the back of the Edicule that actually still shows the original rock. And I should point out that this was a surprise, because the assumption that most scholars had was that basically the whole block, so basically, Constantine, the Constantinian architects would have isolated the tomb of Jesus, but in a sense the received wisdom had been that, the destruction by Al-Hakim in 1009 AD basically had hacked away all that had been left. So again, it's interesting to see, how sometimes in this case, of course, it was a restoration project rather than a research project per se, but all these give a chance to understand our sites better. Well, and finally, you always need to have a bit of an and finally thing, and I'll finish on a slightly humorous note. Apologies, but I couldn't resist the pun. Research on one of the limestone altars these are now in the Israel Museum, has shown actually residues of cannabinoid substances that were burnt on the altar. Of course, what is more fascinating is that here we're talking about Arad. I already mentioned Tel Arad, and this is a temple in a royal fortress. So the likelihood, at least certainly that's where I would put my money, is that the temple is dedicated to the main god of the ruling dynasty, so the good Lord himself. Of course, what would be a bit even more shocking is that we know precious little about what was happening in the temple in Jerusalem. So in a sense, some of our ideas of what may have been happening at the temple in Jerusalem, our best approximation of what the temple in Jerusalem may have looked like, may have worked, is looking precisely at a site like Tel Arad, which we know is a fortress, which we know is in the control of the ruling dynasty. So basically, probably the closest to what the royal temple itself would have had. Now in this, just to also bring it to a conclusion and then leave you to your questions, research can always show us something fascinating, something new, also some spanner in our works. And I think the role of the archaeologist and biblical scholar in this is not to try and defend any given position. I think I'm quite convinced, even from a personal and spiritual point of view, truth does not need to be defended, but to be explored. I think we also need to be aware, especially as historians and archaeologists, that the past is a foreign country. I think this is a case in point. And that we need to try and understand it on its own terms, not on our terms. And coming from a faith perspective, because I do want to bring that in ultimately, and as one that believes in a God of history and also in a God of the incarnation, I'm quite convinced that the deeper I go in history, the closer we can get actually to the good Lord. Thank you very much.